Hello, Lesley. Good to see you, and thank you for joining me.
Oh,
So, let's start then with the opening questions around what brought you to Quakers and what were you looking for and what did you find?
right. So, um, you have to understand to start with that I come from a very specifically non-religious household. Religion is bad, bad, and dangerous, but very interesting sociologically. So I'd visited a lot of churches and got dragged around them, but it wasn't what we did. And RE was quite interesting too, on the grounds of what other people did. And there was one particular RE homework. I must have been 12 or 13. And the task was to draw crucifixion or resurrection. And I've recreated what I drew. And
Wow.
that was, while I was drawing that, I was thinking about the bit of the Bible story that says that the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. And I understood through drawing that for me, the core of the story was about God wasn't in the Holy of Holies that only the top priests could see, but was accessible. And although I didn't believe that, I understood that. Now, we had a system in school where you handed your homework in to the monitor for that subject. And the RE monitor was Susan, good Methodist Sunday school teacher. She was horrified. That's almost blasphemy. That's the rising of the SUN, not the SON. And I was rather worried what Mr. Mace, the RE teacher, would think about it, but well, too late. When he came back, he'd written on the back, A minus, very interesting. Phew, not only was he not cross with me, but it was permission to think, and to play with the stories and try and understand them in my own way, which was really important. So fast forward to another bit about the same RE teacher who organised a residential weekend for at the beginning of your sixth form. And this was on Calshot Spit. So if you think of where the Isle of Wight is on the middle of the south coast, and then there's an inlet going up to Southampton, it's not a very jolly place. It's got army buildings on the end of the spit. It's got Fawley Refinery, oil refinery behind it. But there were all kinds of talks and things. And then on Sunday morning, I woke up before anybody else in my room and I wanted to be alone. So I got dressed very quietly and went out onto the spit for a walk. I promise this is my last picture. You're going to think I can't see anything very much. That's because it was very misty. So you've got a shingle beach going down to a fairly muddy foreshore and the flat calm sea and mist and the sun trying to burn off the mist. The only bit that was actually beautiful were the groins where you had vertical poles, slightly odd design, but vertical bits of wood trying to hold the beach in place. And they'd weathered into a white, and the grain of it was very apparent, really tactile. And that sun trying to burn through the mist, it's a good metaphor for what was happening. The words I used then was that I decided that God was God. I didn't understand what I was saying, but this religion stuff was not simply sociologically interesting. It was going to be important to me, but I didn't understand in what way. And it certainly wasn't driving me towards going to church. But the stories I knew were biblical stories. So that was the sort of the words, the images that I had to play around with. fast forward again. So I'm now in the summer that's between my first year and second year at university. And a friend, another Methodist friend, invited me along to a Methodist youth evensong. I think they must have gathered the young Methodists from all around South Hampshire. And I sat there thinking, I do wish they'd just shut up. And the other half of my brain said, you can't expect people to get together and just shut up. And the first half said, isn't that what the Quakers do? So I decided then and there that I was going to go to the Quaker meeting when I went back to university, because I walked past it between my college and the middle of town. So I knew where to go. And that sense of being able to explore this idea of what did I mean by saying God was God, in company with other people, but without all these words and stuff going on, that's what I wanted. So I went back to university on Freshers' Week, and the place was plastered with little posters saying, who are the Quakers? Come and find out. I thought, my God, if they're like that, I don't want to know. But I thought, well, you thought this was going to be important to you. You can go once. I'm sure you can survive going once and escape if necessary. So I went, and I just felt like I fitted. It was what I was looking for. And so I kept going. And I spent quite a lot of time after meetings helping in the kitchen, because actually standing at the kitchen sink, washing up, is a really useful place to have a conversation, because you're not eyeball to eyeball. And if it all gets a bit too much, you can escape saying, I'll just go and see if there are any more dirty mugs. I'd not been going very long, only a few weeks, when there was a notice after meeting that said there's going to be a bit of an emergency meeting today after coffee, and we'd like everybody who can possibly stay to stay. So I thought, well, I'm everybody, I better stay. I'm sure if somebody had thought I would, they would probably have told me not to. Because this meeting was a reaction to what had happened the week before at the business meeting, the local business meeting. The warden had asked if her boyfriend could come and live in the flat, in the warden's flat. And there were some people who said, well, yeah, of course. And there were other people who thought, this is terrible. This is having people living in sin in a Quaker flat. We can't have it. And it's 1974. You know, the two views of this were current. You know, it didn't seem at all peculiar to me that there should be these two reactions. But clearly, the week before, they'd had a major bust up. A major bust up to the point that somebody had said, let's take a vote on it. And they had, and the clerk resigned forthwith. So what I'd stumbled into, I now understand as the elders trying to bring people back together and mend the hurts and deal with things and explain why Quaker Business Method is important and why we don't vote. And it might have put me right off. But in fact, just here are some people who are trying to keep their community together, for whom that's really important, and trying to do so lovingly, but who have an understanding of how you get people to make a collective decision about something that is is not, I mean, all the ways that everybody else I knew who wanted to take a collective decision on thing, everybody had a vote, and that was democracy, and that was the sort of the gold standard. But here were people who were going beyond that, who were saying, collectively, if we're faithful, we will be led. Wow. So, although that might have totally put me off, it didn't put me off. It really encouraged me that this was a special community that I wanted to be a part of. So I carried on going to meeting. And some number of years later, I applied for membership, and I found myself very quickly as assistant clerk. I was assistant clerk to Anne Castle, who's one of the Annes that was involved in the Quaker tapestry, oversaw the things in the Quaker tapestry. Anne has a Quaker, she's birthright with knobs on is how I describe it. All the people from the sort of Quaker history, the Berkeleys, the Gurneys, the Cadburys, the Rowntrees, they're all on her family tree somewhere. So I was learning from somebody from whom this is not some peculiar new way of doing Quaker business. This is what my family does. It's normal, it's natural. It was very relaxed. And I reckon I learnt most of what I know about being a clerk, and I've done a lot of clerking. I've learnt most of it from Anne Castle. A few local business meetings, well, they were called preparative meetings back then, a few later after I started, the Parliament was going to debate the death penalty. So the death penalty had been abolished almost some years before, but it was going to be talked about again. So I suggested that our meeting might like to write to our MP. And she said, good idea, you take that bit of business. So this was the first time I'd taken responsibility for some business at the local meeting. And I explained, I thought this would be a good idea. And somebody said, well, that would be okay if we are all actually agreed about the death penalty. But actually, I think it's a good idea. And I'm sitting at the table inside going, what? A Quaker in favour of the death penalty? How can you fit that in with what I understand about Quaker values and testimonies? But what I said was, in that case, we can't write as a meeting, but I would encourage everybody to write individually. And when I thought about it afterwards, I realised that was actually quite a good outcome, because as far as the MP is concerned, instead of getting one letter from a Quaker meeting, well, of course they would think that, wouldn't they? He would have got a whole number of letters, most of which said death penalty is a bad idea. I think we later on had a discussion as a meeting, a sort of meeting for learning kind of thing. But that sense that actually the Quaker Business Method, in a very odd way, had delivered a better outcome than had we voted. A year or so later, I was one of the friends who went to the World Gathering of Young Friends. So I was not involved with Young Friends. Somehow it didn't happen, and I was quite happy where I was. So I didn't know the group of young people particularly well. And because I taught, and because of when it was in the end of term, I didn't travel with the main group. I set off later and arrived earlier than everybody else. And please, could you volunteer to do something? So I wrote my name down on the doorkeeping list. That seemed innocuous. I can do that. I didn't realise that the Quaker convention, that if there isn't a convener of the group. The first named person is the convener. So I was convener of doorkeepers. This gathering was a gathering of people from the different Quaker traditions around the world. So you will know that our meetings are unprogrammed. They're silence into which people might minister. And actually, the majority of friends have programmed worship. And if you go to one of their services, it's a church service, you have to listen quite hard to find the Quaker bit that's different from any other nonconformist service. And up until our gathering, every time Quakers had got together from across the world, they worshipped separately. So you had non-programmed worship and programmed worship, and then they came together to discuss whatever. But the Young Friends Committee who organised this gathering had decided that it was important that we tried to worship together. So I tried to stick to the idea that we worshipped together. But boy, was that hard, because the bit of unprogrammed worship we'd failed to convey was the idea that you have a space between pieces of ministry. So, and we probably had said, you leave space in between, but what is space? Now, for you and me, that would be minimum 5 minutes, probably, and probably more, but we hadn't conveyed that. So it felt like me, it was more like 10 seconds. And the term I learned was popcorn ministry. So people keep popping up. Pop, pop, pop. It was non-stop. Shut up. Meanwhile, there was this group of people from around the world with all kinds of experience. And in particular, in my home group, there was a young man from South Africa who had registered himself as black, although he was actually coloured. And he was campaigning against apartheid, but wanting to campaign peacefully. And that put him in danger with the people who were wanting to campaign using violence because, well, it was, giving in to the enemy if you weren't going to be violent. And that danger that he was in, it was some days before he expressed it. But I have never felt that fear. I haven't before or since. So there's all this other stuff that you're dealing with, and how would I deal with it? Well, silent worship. And it wasn't happening. So on the Wednesday of this week, the committee, the little committee of young friends who were running it, decided that in the evening there was going to be a quarter of an hour's programmed silence. There will be no ministry. And that's how the evening session would start. And please would the home groups talk about silent ministry and so on in our time together. And they came to me as convener of doorkeepers to say, please, will you make sure that nobody comes into the room during that programmed silence? So, at any meeting, a session starts and it's silence, and then the clerks say, please, will the doorkeepers let in the latecomers? Well, it was that tradition. It was my tradition. It felt right. I understood. You can't stop people going out. I desperately need the loo. You can't stop them, but you can stop people coming in. So the doorkeepers arrived a little bit early, as good doorkeepers do. And I said this to them, and they said, I can't do that. I can't stop people coming into worship. And it wasn't part of their tradition, so they hadn't got that experience. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to do it myself. So if you imagine a hall, there might have been, I don't know how many people, getting on for 300, I guess. And this hall had fire exits, but it only had one entrance off the corridor, and the doors moved into the room. So during the silence, with hindsight and time, I would have done all sorts of things differently. But if I had been outside the door, I don't think I could have stopped people coming in, because apart from anything else, I don't speak Spanish, which is very much the second language that the gathering was using. So I stood on the inside of the door with my back to the place where the two doors came in. So physically, they could not come in. And that conflict of feelings, so that inside the hall is silent. This is what I've been aching for. This is what I need. This is my worship. This is where, just wow, this is me. I so need this. And yet being very aware that there were people outside the door, because during that silence, the people who weren't used to it were sitting there thinking, not much happening here, is there? I'll just go and get. So there were probably 10 people who went out during that time. And then there were some latecomers. So there was quite a little gathering of people outside, getting on for 20. And from time to time, and nobody had actually said you're not going to be allowed back in. And I hadn't written a notice that explained it even in English, because I hadn't thought to. And so from time to time, they pushed gently on the doors and then nudged me gently in the back. And I shake my head to say, no, I'm not going to let you in. But dealing with that situation where you're imposing your will on other people, and yet you know it's right for the well-being of the group that is gathered, that lives with me still. And I think I did the right thing. As with hindsight, you could have done it differently and better. But I think I was right to say you're not allowed in. But it was tough, and it lived with me. And there's that sense that sometimes you have to do that when your clerk or elder is. It's not easy, and it doesn't always go down well. And you have to be very careful that why you're doing it. And it's much, in a sense, I had it easy at World Gathering, because there was another group of people who had discerned that this is what should happen. All I had to do was do it. But when you're on the group that's discerning, it's not so easy. When you're even when you're clear this is the discernment and you're reporting it and it doesn't go down well with people, it's not easy. And sometimes as clerk, you make a decision, you make the decision, this is my discernment. Totally frivolous example. Soon after I came back from the gathering, I was monthly meeting clerk, so what we now call area meeting clerk. And somebody had to give a report to the meeting, but it was the day of his daughter's birthday. She would have been about 9, and the family was coming. So we organised that the children were taken for a walk along the beach to the lifeboat station, which was open. And then they came back along the beach, and it timed it beautifully. They arrived back with us in time for the closing worship. And then we all shook hands. And I said, before you move, it's Anna's birthday today. Please, could we all sing happy birthday to Anna? and they all sang happy birthday to Anna, and somebody arrived out at the kitchen with a cake with candles on. And that was fine, wasn't it? Except that during monthly meeting tea, somebody came to see me and said it was really unquakerly to sing happy birthday. And who was Anna anyway? So I explained that Anna had given up her birthday afternoon in order that her father could give the report. And I thought the least we could do was to show our gratitude for that in some way that a child would understand. I hope I was graceful about it. The person humphed off somewhere. I met Anna's father years later, well, no, decades later. And he said, you know, you're part of the family folklore. We still quite often say to one another, do you remember when monthly meetings sang happy birthday to Anna? And that sense that I got it right, but I still had to deal with the criticism. And that's, yeah, it's tough learning, but that's where I am.
Gosh, so many of your stories are about holding boundaries within the space. I mean, all of your examples there are coming into this community, feeling very much at home and being asked to be a servant of the meeting in some way. And then holding a boundary, and even when it's quite uncomfortable, and I can feel the nudging in my back now of that door. Really interesting kind of metaphorically and real symbols there, isn't it, about holding boundaries? So where are you up to at the moment then in terms of, why do you stay? Is it all about standing at the door being nudged, or are there other aspects of your, why you stay in this meeting, this way of worship?
I stay with the way of worship because it's the way of worship that allows me to deal with, to process what is happening around me, and to work out what I can best do, and to support other people and pray for other people. Don't ask me what I mean by that, because I don't know, but I do it. It's my community whose way of worship upholds me.
And that picture that you showed us at the beginning, you must be an artist, must you, to have these pictures so readily to hand. You showed us, first of all, that picture of crucifixion and resurrection. Where are you now then with that, those theological and issues?
I think I would probably describe myself as theist, but I hesitate to use words, because on the whole, I some of my most instinctive thoughts are not words, they're pictures. And I learned a lot about, no, I didn't learn a lot. I learned something of theology through gifts and discoveries. I said I worked as clerk with Anne Castle. She and I were the two people who joined the gifts and discoveries process, and we went to the neighbouring meeting and became part of their group. I learned a lot, because it wasn't part of my background at all. So that's where my teaching came from. But on the whole, it's not something that bothers me. It's not, the words don't matter. it's the experience that is not necessarily expressed in words that's important to me, which is why I found myself in a very strange position. So I was clerk of the Book of Discipline Revision Preparation Group, which was set up when yearly meeting couldn't make up its mind whether or not to revise the Book of Discipline. So they set up a preparation group instead. And the thing that was seen as the big stumbling block was the theological argument, the more Christocentric friends and the non-theist friends. People used to talk about the whole banana, but in fact, it's not a banana shape, it's multidimensional. And so this was the problem. This was what was seen as the problem. And if we revise the Book of Discipline, we'll get into total disarray because we'll fall out over the theology. And so here was somebody who really didn't know anything about theology, clerking a group with that as one part of the thinking behind why we were there. And as so often, I find myself being asked to do things that I know nothing about, but I perhaps knowing nothing about it is what I bring. So there was a conference at Woodbrook. Well, not a conference. Yes, it was a conference. We brought together I think it must have been about 20 of the theologians of different sort of strands of thinking around Britain Yearly Meeting and said, talk, and more importantly, listen. And then we wrote a book that came out of that called God's Words and Us, and got people in the meetings to read it. And I find it totally ridiculous that here I am who still feels I don't know anything about theology, and it's not my pigeon. And yet the one book that I had any hand in writing is something that is theological. But that perhaps it's that the theory doesn't matter, that the story and the experience of individuals is what speaks to me rather than theoretical stuff.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's kind of been one of the things that I'm reflecting on is, kind of 50 years ago, perhaps there was this context, and some of your stories earlier were around this, the context of a Christian culture and a strongly biblical tradition just across the culture in the UK. And in that context, it really makes sense that we have a religious tradition that rebels against that and kind of softens the edges of some of that in compassion for people's lives. Um, but the context has completely changed, doesn't it? And we are not that anymore as a UK culture. Um, and I wonder sometimes if some of us, the older group, if you like, of us, is still making arguments on and still taking positions which are a rebellion against things which no longer exist. And this has come up in a couple of conversations that I've had now. So I just wonder whether this like move away from Christianity, this secularism, this words don't matter, has led us very well. It's served us very well for a long time. But at the moment, I just wonder whether there isn't a Christian kind of strong backbone in the country at large anymore because church attendance is falling and religious education in schools is not what it was. And we seem to have lost the kind of corporate worship in schools. And children now, you say, well, do you know this hymn? And they don't. Um, can children nowadays say the Lord's Prayer like we can just say it without thinking? It just we can say it. And in that changed context, 50 years later, we're not fighting the same battles that we were in 1975. Do you think that this this calls for a little bit more clarity for Society of Friends?
Two things. I was saying the words don't matter. I say the words don't matter because I think in pictures, which I think is quite unusual. So I've shown you two. Up on the wall behind me is Wales. So I worked with Welsh friends, and when there was some problem, I don't remember what the problem was, I drew, because drawing is a way of allowing myself to pray that is not verbal. So I don't think many friends do that. So when I say I don't use words, that's not saying I don't think Quakers should use words. It's saying something about who I am and how I think. The idea that there is a background of Christian understanding. You and I might have listened to what was being said in school. My sister's about to be 60, and she used to switch off. I can't switch off. My hearing's not very good, and if I can hear you, I'm listening. I might not be able to hear you, but if I can, I listen. But she doesn't have that. So she sat through assembly and RE lessons with her friend giving a nudge in the ribs if she thought that it was a notice Diane ought to be listening to. And I don't think she ever learnt to say the Lord's Prayer. She didn't understand why the Samaritans were called the Samaritans, because she didn't know the biblical story. I think there are more different stories out there because it's not specifically Christian. But my experience of the people who show up in my meeting as attenders, and quite a lot of them are younger. Well, I belong to a small meeting, so quite a lot of them is the small number, but their background is very much in a Christianity, some of them are rebelling against, well, not rebelling against, but exploring beyond. And so that sense that society is losing its Christian foundations is not something that I worry about.
Because you don't think it's happening, or because the loss of it is not a concern?
A bit of both. If the Christian story is what I use to express myself, and it gives me a way of communicating, then that's fine. And if other people have other stories and other ways of thinking about it, that's fine too.
So the Book of Discipline revision, when was that you were on that then? That was on the 1994 rewrite, or just this recent one?
No. So in 2014, yearly meeting was asked, should we revise the book? And they said, no. So they set up a revision preparation group, which I clerked, and we reported in 2018, having got, yes, we did God, Words and Us, but in my mind, most importantly, there was the Reading Quaker Faith and Practice project, where we asked people to read Quaker Faith and Practice and do so within your meeting. And so that bit that you read the whole thing and not just cherry picked your favourite bits, I think really made it clear to people that there was an awful lot of stuff there that really was not what we needed to have in it. So, of course, I did the most wonderful presentation to yearly meeting, but actually it was because people had read the book and decided that this needs replacing.
So what can you remember of your key messages then? Because it felt to me, like I'm putting you on the spot here, but just what sticks in your mind? Because I must admit, it felt to me like there was an agenda to change the Book of Discipline when nobody really wanted it to be changed. Like that's my abiding memory of that whole time. That I still don't really know why we're rewriting it. So what's the headline there of what do you remember of what are some of the fundamental problems with it?
There are fundamental problems in. Let me start at the beginning. Somebody described the Book of Discipline to me as a family portrait. And you have to keep on having family portraits because otherwise the younger generation aren't in them. And so it seemed to me that there, and it seemed to the committee, and you have to understand that the committee had people who were against the whole project, but it was a balanced committee in that sense, and they were against the project until they started working on it and decided that perhaps they should change their minds. So the first thing is that there were things missing because it was out of date. There were also things in there that were probably not what we would want to say now. And there was a whole lot of stuff that, like, for example, safeguarding, the word doesn't exist anymore because the way society organizes things is different and has moved on. And so all those things, and it's safeguarding was the biggest one, but there are a whole lot of stuff that needs to be in there. And I think also the message that the presentation wanted to give is that the Society of Friends changes. So that I said I was taught to clerk by Anne Castle, and that sense that I remember Anne during the revision, the last revision, and that sense that, well, of course we do this, of course we move on. She might have been a lady, she came from a long-standing Quaker family, but of course we move on. And the other long-standing Quaker family I'm associated with is Hazel's family. Hazel and I described one another as companions. She was the generation older than me. She started as my landlady. But I'm now an honorary member of her family. And I'm sitting now at a desk that was made by her great-grandfather when he was warden of a Quaker meeting. And I know what's happened to that family since then. I know how they've embraced change in all sorts of aspects of their life, including religion. The kind of Quaker he was 150 years ago is not the kind of Quaker that his great, have I got the right number of greats, granddaughter is. That Quakerism changes, and that is not to be feared.
So what's your impression of how Quakers are today then? That great grandfather would look today and notice the differences. I mean, I sense that you're saying that the book is being revised because Quakerism today is very different. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why this video series has come about, because the conference in October of the future of Quakers was saying that we're a declining society, slightly aging. The average is going from 60 to 61, so it's a very slight aging, and 10,000 Quakers remain, whereas only a few years ago there was 12,000, and so there's a gradual decline. And you're saying that you get this sense that Quakerism is changing and that that's fine. So how would you characterize that then?
Well, I mean, if you read the books of discipline that were around in Hazel's great grandfather's time, they are very, very clearly Christocentric.
Mm.
And all this non-theist rubbish and all that I've been saying is not how they thought. But that doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't approve of people's thought processes changing, of society changing. So no, it doesn't frighten me.
I'm just trying to understand. Are you, I don't know if I heard you clearly. Did you describe yourself as theist or non-theist?
Yes.
Theist.
Well, it's
I'm only just, it's a very important distinction because I heard you say theist, which I'm taking to mean that you experience God. Um, but that what I'm hearing you say now is that we've become more of a non-theist society and that that's okay. I'm not trying to mischaracterize what you're saying, but I'm trying to just be clear about it.
20, 30 years ago, people used to ask me far more regularly than they do now, are you a Christian? To which I used to answer, are you? And if they said no, I said yes. And if they said yes, I said no. And I wasn't being awkward or playing
No,
around.
I
I
can
was trying to use language as they used language. So if you identify yourself as a Christian, you will have a very clear idea of what Christian means. And you believe this and this and this and this and this. And it was almost certain that I didn't believe most of that. So the answer was no. Whereas if you're talking to somebody who is not a Christian, then Christian is about having an understanding of spirituality, of a relationship with a God, that all of which seems totally daft to you. And I was in the camp that seemed totally daft. So if you could keep the conversation going for half an hour, then they turn around and say, oh, well, you know, you're really like us. But it's about using the language of the person that you're talking to. So, I mean, if I was asked a question by somebody who only spoke French, I would try and answer it in French with very limited vocabulary, extremely dodgy grammar, but at least I will be communicating in a language that they understood. And I think we're not aware how the language that we use, that is English because that's us, how that is not as exact as we think it is. T.S. Eliot describes words as slip, slide, decay with imprecision. And yeah, they do. And I think people try and think it's very rigid, and it ain't.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of where Quakers are today,
Mm-hmm.
and how we're changing, and the new book of discipline will try to capture all of that. Are we are we on a trajectory that will move further and further away from Christianity into non-theism or into atheism?
No,
And
I don't.
at what point do we write out all mention of Christianity whatsoever? And is that the trajectory that we're on? No.
No, that's not the trajectory that we're on. I think we're on a trajectory of listening to each other more clearly. And I think the word I used was open heartedly. So, no, I don't think so. When I was preparing to do that presentation to yearly meetings saying, I think we ought to revise the book of discipline, that was very carefully prepared. It was prepared ministry. And so trying to get the theological balance to say to say we're all in this together and we learn from one another. That was important. And one of the key things was, how often do you use the word God? And then on the Friday, as yearly meeting gathered, the Guardian had a headline: Quakers prepare to abandon God. So, yeah, this was not the message I wanted to get across. So I spent that evening spattering the word God through my presentation to try and get that balance correct.
Wow, what a correction from the Guardian. I wouldn't have. So the Guardian headline there has perhaps nudged us back onto a course with God.
No, I don't think that at all. It was about the balance and about speaking to the audience where the audience was, not where they had been before the Guardian ran that headline.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so really you're giving me the impression of steering quite a careful path there. I mean, I really like your story of, well, are you a Christian? And then I'll know how to answer you, because it's not quite what you're not going to hear me correctly otherwise. I like that idea of understanding what language your audience is going to understand you in. I suppose one of the things that I've been thinking about is, do we is it right to privilege and to listen to everyone equally? Now, fundamentally, probably most Quakers would say, well, yes, of course, we should listen to everyone equally. But I wonder sometimes whether some people are able to access depths, spiritual insights, perhaps having had deep experiences or a long life of experiences, whatever it might be, and that there is something of value and of weight in what they say, whereas somebody who can't articulate any of that still has opinions. I mean, a lot of opinions. And one of the things that I'm trying to get at in these videos, and I think I talk about it all the way back in November in my second introduction interview video, because the second introduction was all about, hold on a second, who am I going to talk to? And how do I make sure that before I listen to people's opinions on X, Y, and Z, I really get a sense of where they're coming from? What is that deep spiritual place that they're coming from before I hear their opinions? And it's made me think about, who do we listen to and what voices get amplified and permitted, and let's hear this. I mean, there's so much noise, so many opinions being put out there. The friend is always looking for words to put in there. So some people will just give them words, hundreds and hundreds of words. And it just sometimes feels like, is some of this just noise and guff, just kind of, as you said very early on, just shut up. And for me, there's something that I don't think we're getting quite right. And I don't know if you were at the conference yourself, were you, in October? I just felt that one of the reasons why I started these conversations is because all of that ministry that we had was really too much just noise. And there wasn't deep reflection. And it was just lots and lots of chat. Um, so I'm not sure we should be listening to all voices equally. I think we really need to look at where the words are coming from, and really examine people in terms of, well, what is your experience of God? And I've started to become more and more religious in my language, I suppose, in really interrogating whether somebody has a prayer life, whether what their experience of God is. Do they feel loved by God? I mean, these kinds of conversations I have with men in the prison, for example. I mean, I'm having deep conversations all the time. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Mhm. And some people are more articulate than others, and I'm not sure that being articulate is necessarily any guide as to whether what they're able to say is useful. Um, I'm sure we all know people who can just witter on and on.
Mm.
Um, so I'm I think we have to. I'm not saying we should listen equally to everyone. I think you're right that there are some people who have an understanding and an ability to communicate an understanding of a particular position that is really helpful. And those people are not always those who you would expect them to be. I think it's easier for us to hear those ideas expressed in our own cultural background, and that cultural background for you and I is Christian, and so we have a background that helps us to hear that. I think I think I think there is also a difficulty about deciding who you're going to listen to, and it's about what you need to listen to them about. So there are people who can help me think about a particular biblical story really effectively, but they may not be the person who is best able to help me think about something totally different. And to some extent, it's about trusting the Quaker processes of nominating and appointing people to particular positions. So ideally, you would like to appoint to a position, for example, of elder, as somebody who might be able to lead those discussions helpfully. And you might appoint a different sort of person as treasurer, or it might be the same person. And I don't actually know my area meeting treasurer very well. But if she's coming to give the annual report and accounts to area meeting, I don't require her to give a 10-minute spiel about her spiritual life. I take that as a given and just get on and tell us about the accounts, will you? And I think judging whether we should listen to somebody simply on our own knowledge of that person and our own knowledge or otherwise of their spiritual understandings and journey and practice is not always the most useful?
Well, I suppose it depends what we mean by useful. Well, I read something just yesterday, something that came out from one of the Quaker bodies, and it said something about this is the message we want to give to the world, like an epistle of some kind. And I mean, really getting into politics. And I suppose this is what I'm getting at here, and I'd be interested to know what you think of this. My immediate response was, why are we not bringing people to our spiritual practice of silent waiting and being in a Quaker meeting as a transformative spiritual practice? Because that's what I do. So I'm coming this from a chaplaincy point of view, you know. I go into prisons and I get to know men and see if this is the kind of thing they might want to come to, and I say come, and then I walk them through and guide them through this process of settling into a meeting in quite a guided way, actually. And it's about settling into the silence and opening our hearts to God and then listening to the word of God and then faith into action. How does it transform your life? But the messages that I'm seeing from Quaker bodies is about saying this about wars and Trump and, you know, the message that we have for the world on peace and equality and simplicity. And I'm thinking, well, let those be. That's not our message. That's not That's not what we have to offer, really. What we have to offer is a spiritual practice that can allow people for God to transform them. We don't have to be telling them the message. People can find the message for themselves through a direct relationship with God. And yet we don't see this message being, let me show you what you can experience through a spiritual practice like we have. Can you see the difference in what?
I can see the difference, but I don't agree, because a whole number of things. Do you remember I said the university was plastered with notices saying, "Who are the Quakers? Come and find out," and how off-putting I thought that was.
Mm.
And so the I think the way in which people come to an understanding of Quakerism, most of them talk about meeting a particular person, perhaps way back.
Yeah.
And or the meeting might possibly be a written thing rather than anything else. I mean, my own story about meeting a Quaker, I missed out because it was half a sentence, and I think it often is half a sentence. My mother had a new colleague who'd moved to the area and had a daughter who was at a Quaker boarding school. Come half term, this girl would have no young companionship. So the mothers organised that she came to tea, you know how mothers do. And I had never met in person anybody who'd been at a boarding school. So I was quite interested to hear how the reality of boarding school matched up with all the boarding school stories I'd read as a child. And on a Sunday morning, we go to meeting. What's meeting? Half a sentence describing a Quaker meeting. And then some years later, I wash up in one. So we don't know where it's going to come from. But I'm not saying we shouldn't shout out saying, I am a Quaker. Most people who know me, all my students knew I was a Quaker. It's one of the things that people know about me. But I don't think I would agree that the primary messages we should be giving out are, and you must be one too, or any suggestion that you might, it's there, it's an offer. And I do think that one of the things that is distinctive about Quaker worship and practice is the way that we see that as being, as quite often leading to involvement in something within the world. So that the the Quaker practice leading to peace, or Quaker practice in leading to involvement in Extinction Rebellion, is that it's not an expectation that it will, but that experience that it often does, and that the two are linked. And so that all parts of your life are sacramental, what you do, the politics you're involved in, or whatever, that is part of your sacramental life. It's not separate from. And that understanding is, I think, fairly unusual at least amongst the Christian churches in the town that I live in.
Hmm. So you don't think there's a danger then that sometimes people skip over the God part and just get into politics? Because it seems to me that we don't have as much variety in where God leads us as you might expect. So what concerns me is that we've become, as you've mentioned, Extinction Rebellion, that there's a huge amount of support for that particular path. But if somebody comes up with a different opinion, so as you know, I have some wrong opinions on things, um, and I'm not so convinced that Quaker meetings support my religious convictions and my sacramental life because they've come out wrong, if you see what I mean. So I feel that it's not actually as straightforward as you're implying there, because there's only there seems to be this set of right opinions that Quakers have at the moment. And if you hold those and you tend to have to sign up to the whole lot, then that's acceptable. But actually, if you don't have those views, it's kind of not talked about and it's kind of pushed out a little bit. And
So I talked about the death penalty, and the
mm,
person in the Quaker meeting who thought the death penalty was okay remained very much part of the group. And we talked about it, and she talked about why, and we talked about why not. So my experience is that having the wrong views is not a problem in the way that you're suggesting. Perhaps I've got rose-colored spectacles. Um,
well, when did that happen? When did, because you mentioned that as quite an early
oh
point.
yeah, it was
Decades
ages ago.
ago. And I think things have changed. And I think in 2025, where we are now, this is far more cancelled, which is the current term. And we have a cancel culture because the rest of society does. We have a cancel culture within Quakers, whereas probably 20, 30 years ago, whenever that story was, probably didn't have it. Whereas now, you can't have particular views without it being, you become a pariah, actually, which is astonishing to me. So I mean that's been a long enough conversation. But thank you for talking it through with me. Where does that leave us then with to hopes for Quakers? Because as I've said, I have a few worries along the lines that I've just mentioned. So what are your, if there's fears or hopes for the future of Quakers?
The what I really hope still exists is somewhere where a community where the practice of worship that is basically silent continues, um, and where there is a freedom to think, which I think we still have. Um, but I hear what you say, but I don't agree. Whether that has the name Quaker, whether it has the same structures that it now has, I don't mind one way or the other. I do think that things need to change and continue to change in order that that should happen. So the big change that's happened since COVID is the ability to do what we're doing now, which is to talk online using Zoom, and the use of Zoom for worship is relatively new. So I'm working with friends in Scotland, and in North Scotland, they've used technological ways of communicating and having group discussions for as long as they've been around, for ages and ages. Because if you're in North Scotland and you want to run a nominations committee, it's the only practical way of doing it because the distances are so vast. And the rest of us are catching up. But that allows all sorts of things to happen. So you will know in North Wales there's a local meeting that is an online local meeting, which is great. But there are other groups that are online that cross area meeting boundaries, and so our current structures can't accommodate what is a real worshipping community within them, and we've got to do something about it. Not sure what, but and the other groups that are outside it, for example, Young Friends General Meeting, Young Friends work across boundaries. I remember being in West Scotland area meeting, and there was an application for membership for somebody who said they were from Glasgow, and Glasgow Friends said, who? And this was a young friend, a very involved young friend, but her worshipping community was Young Friends in Scotland, and she lived in Glasgow. So it had to be West Scotland that she applied for membership from. Is that sensible? Is there some other way of doing it? So you will know that the work that's happening in Scotland to look at how things might be different and organised different, structured differently, is different from what happened in Wales. So that the proposal, I have to say it surprised me, but the proposal that came from the discernment of the committee was that there should be one area meeting for the whole of Scotland. And then there are that means you have to have other thoughts about how you might bring local meetings together. And it's called option 4 because, well, at the time there were 4 options. And it's trying to imagine how you might structure things so that you still have that idea of worshipping communities getting together, rather than sort of congregationalist approach where it's, the congregation decides everything. Bringing people together is really important and really enriching. But how you might do that more fluidly and flexibly within a whole Scotland area meeting. They haven't agreed it yet. I don't know if they will. I haven't a clue if it's the best thing, the best structure, but it's a conversation that I think needs to happen and needs to continue to happen, because you said the number of Quakers are going down, but there are Quakers out there who aren't counted and can't be counted. I mean, that is the number of people who are members of an area meeting is going down. Are there other Quakers out there? Yes, there are. Don't know how you do it, but it's an exciting story, but it is changing. And that sense that Quakerism changes and will continue to change, I think, is important, and I look forward to it rather than fear it.
Mm. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your time. We've covered quite a lot there, so that's great. Thank you very much, Lesley.
Thank you.